Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. And today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. César Jiménez-Martínez is a lecturer in global media and communications at Cardiff University in Wales. Valerie Gruest, a doctoral student at Northwestern and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce César in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, the Department of Communication Studies, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Valerie will tell us more about César's research and career in just a minute. Then César will deliver his seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen at any point in time. Once César has concluded his presentation, Valerie will moderate them, your questions, that is. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Valerie, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you so much for having me as a moderator for the seminar. It is an absolute honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Jiménez-Martínez holds a BA in journalism from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, an MSc MA in Global Media and Communications from the London School of Economics and Political Science and the University of Southern California, as well as a PhD in Media and Communications from the London School of Economics and Political Science. His research interests include media nationalism, visibility, public diplomacy, nation branding, media representation, social movements, and media and globalization. He is interested in how particular representations of the nation are created and communicated through the complex contemporary media space for both domestic and foreign audiences in order to advance political, economic, and cultural goals. His focus is on the different tensions and struggles that arise during this process, especially in the context of Latin American societies. Dr. Jiménez-Martínez has achieved numerous awards through his work. Most recently, he received honorable mention for Best Paper in the Public Diplomacy Interest Group at the 2021 ICA Annual Conference, as well as the 2021 Anthony D. Smith Award for Outstanding Article published in Nations and Nationalism for Digital Nationalism. Dr. Jiménez-Martínez is currently a lecturer in global media and communications at Cardiff University. He's also author of an extensive selection of publications, including Globalization in the Media, Soft Power and Media Power, Western Foreign Correspondents in the Making of Israel's Image Overseas, The Public as a Problem, Protest, Public Diplomacy, and the Pandemic, among many others. In addition to his scholarly work, Dr. Jiménez-Martínez has experience as a reporter for El Mercurio newspaper in Chile, researcher and producer in TV and film productions for Nueva Imagen in Chile, and account executive for nation branding projects at Ogilvy. Over the years, he has been an active member in society through his public engagement and mentorship experiences. We are so honored to have Dr. Jiménez-Martínez today to share with us his knowledge and experience. Thank you so much. The screen is all yours.
Muchas gracias. Obrigado. Thank you very much, Pablo and Valerie. And yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to take part in this seminar. Yeah, it was very embarrassing to hear the introduction by Valerie, but I really appreciate the kind words. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So a few months ago, when I received the invitation to take part in this seminar, my first reaction was, of course, that was my answer. And then it took me a while to think of, well, what I'm going to present today, because quite often we in academia present a particular book or a paper or something that we have written. But currently I'm kind of like in a moment in between, in which I'm looking at still embracing some of my previous interests, but I'm trying to also to expand them into new areas and into new research. So that's why in the blurb that I sent for this presentation, I said that this is going to be like a Janus-faced presentation. So I'm going to look a little bit at my past, some of the things that I've been reading in the last few years, but I'm also going to hint some of the areas and some of the subjects that I'm currently researching and that I'm aiming to also write more about in the future. But the umbrella that joins all this is my interest in what some authors have called mediated nationhood, which is basically how the idea of the nation is constructed through the media, is also commercialized through the media, but it's also contested in and through the media, and all these different topics are going to be explored during the time in which I am going to be talking. So yes, as I said, it's going to make reference to some of my previous work. So I'm going to rely a lot on a book that I published a little while ago, which focuses on the protests in Brazil 2013, but I'm also going to go beyond that. And I emphasize, it should be clear from what Valerie said earlier on, that I am not from Brazil, I am from Chile. And I stress that because I've been surprised by how scarce sometimes intra-Latin American research is. And quite often we, especially when we work in Europe or the United States, we're expected to work exclusively in the place where we come from, but that is not the case. So to clarify where things come from, my interests are based a lot on my previous experience. So before being an academic in a past life, I used to work as part of a multinational company. And one of the many projects that I worked on had to do with promoting a brand for Chile overseas. That's an image of me when I was in the Expo Shanghai in 2010. That's the Chilean pavilion that you can see behind me. And now when I look backwards, I'm sometimes embarrassed of how naive I was in some of the things that I did. But that was part of the work, and the idea was trying to construct a particular version of Chile to be communicated overseas. And the idea was managing media representations to have to construct a version of Chile that could attract investors, could attract tourists also to the country, and because of that, the concern was very much tapped into how we're seen abroad. What is the world telling about us? And then when I started my academic career, that was my original interest. That interest that quite often people who are not from Western Europe or from the United States, and we really want to see how the world is looking at us. What do they say about us? And originally, my research, I was interested in doing research on Chile at the beginning, and I did a bit of that. Like I focused on an episode of, maybe some of you remember, when 33 Chilean miners were rescued, and that became a big media event. And some of my early research was very much about how the foreign media interpreted and looked at that rescue. But at some point, I wanted to change a little bit, and I wanted to explore a new terrain. And by suggestion of some people, I started looking at Brazil. I'm talking like about around 9 years ago that my interest in Brazil began. And it was partly because at the time I was starting my PhD, and someone told me, have you realized that while you're doing your PhD, Brazil is going to organize the World Cup and the Olympics, okay? And not only that, at the time there was a big discussion about the BRICS, about how the BRICS were going to become the economies that were going to dominate the world in the 21st century, etc., etc. So there was very much this very positive view. So I started conducting research, again, interested in this idea of how the world is looking at us, but also what governments are doing to try to manage that. And when I started my research, there was this very positive view about Brazil. So this is an example of some of the literature, but also some press at the time. And you can see that very much the discussion was about how Brazil was on the rise, how there was a new Brazil emerging. And for me, it was totally new to Brazil. It was very interesting to start reading these very optimistic views. There is that very famous or infamous covered by The Economist, and that's a quote by Monocle magazine saying about how the sun is shining on brand Brazil. However, very soon when I started doing my research, these were the kind of images, these were the kind of stories about Brazil that I found, and particularly in foreign media. And that was because there was a series of protests that were happening that started in June 2013, which was precisely 1 year before Brazil was going to host the World Cup. And the World Cup, by the way, was going to be like the icing on the cake, like the confirmation of how wonderful Brazil was doing in terms of political stability, in terms of the economy, in terms of overcoming poverty. And you can see that there was plenty of surprise at that time, and basically many of the images that we could see about Brazil, many of the narratives that we could see about Brazil had nothing to do with the intention that authorities had of communicating this really positive view of the nation. So many of you probably are familiar with this, what will happen in June 2013 in Brazil, which has had different names. The Jornais de Junho, that has been translated as June Journeys, or June sometimes simply was called, but it was at that time, it was the largest unrest that Brazil had had in more than 20 years. And it was originally, like it has happened with protests in other places, such as Chile, a movement that had a very specific target. In this case, was against the rise in public transportation fares, but then very soon expanded to broader issues. And in terms of numbers, it's been estimated that 1 in every 20 Brazilians took part at some point in the demonstrations that spread all over Brazil. And there is always the example of the peak that was when in 20 June 2013, 1 million people protested in 353 cities and towns. And it's very interesting, especially when we take into account what happened afterwards, the original reaction by journalists and academics, because it was a very romantic and celebratory view of the protests. So then there were reports about how this was a social awakening in Brazil. Some talk also about the tropical spring in reference to the Arabian Spring. And also I remember how the Manuel Castells, for instance, had just published a version in Portuguese of one of his books about social movements, and the afterword of the book, written especially for Brazil, started with the words, "It happened there as well." So it was this very romantic and positive view of what happened in Brazil. And you can see there that how they were seen as very relevant for society, but also it's interesting how over time there has been a much more skeptical view of them. This is a tweet in which by former President Lula da Silva, in which you can see that it's really far from that originally a romantic view. And it's interesting how over time they have been seen still to some extent as a way to measure what has happened in Brazil in the coming years. So sometimes from an ironic perspective, as you can see in the Twitter, but it's definitely a very relevant episode for contemporary history of Brazil. There have been several books, articles, plenty of research about them. However, when I started doing research, I noticed that there was limited attention to the potential impact of the protests on the symbolic construction and projection of the Brazilian nation in both domestic and international media, what we can call the image of Brazil, okay? And I found it very interesting because when looking at discussions in the media, there were some explicit concerns or debates about that. This is just one single day. All of these extras are from the 23rd June 2013, which you can see that there was a newspaper saying that the protests ruined the image of Brazil, or then a report in BBC saying that the protests were not the image that Brazil wanted to present, or that the protests were exploded a nation's fun-loving image. So again, I found it very interesting that there were explicit calls and mentions to the idea of the image, but that was not necessarily mentioned. And also internally, domestically, there was a report by a consultant called Imagem Corporativa, and according to that report, the stories in the foreign media about the protests were negative because they questioned the image of Brazil as an emerging power. Also, there was a survey by Pew Research Center that said that the image, according to the people surveyed, damaged the image of Brazil abroad. And at some point, I talked to a former minister of Dilma Rousseff, who said that basically the protests could change the positive image that Brazil had. So I started looking at research, and that took me in the direction of nation branding, soft power, and so on. But with the exception of works like what you can see, the Melissa Aronsich and other critical scholars, I found it very frustrating, the literature on the topic, because it's a very instrumental literature which is aimed at helping practitioners, and it's very atheoretical, we can say. Again, the work of Melissa Aronsich, Nadia Kaneva, and others, I found it much richer, much interesting, but the dominant, at least at that time, literature on nation branding, soft power, public diplomacy, I found it really, really poor. So it wasn't something that I really wanted to engage that much with. So I started looking much more at those critical works, but also started dwelling into this idea of the image, because the word image in this case does not refer to visual representations, also refer texts or sounds also. And that threw me back to the concept that Balding has written about image, kind of like the subjective knowledge of ourselves and our surroundings, or the cognitive representation, perception, or reputation of a national community, its geographical location, stability, etc., etc. And I started reading much more about that, and also about literature on the media and the nation. And I found really interesting what Michael Billig says in his classic work of Banal Nationalism, about how he writes about the voice of the nation. But I focus much more on the idea of how the image of the nation is a fiction, which conceals the continuous struggles that are constitutive of nationhood. And those struggles are what I'm especially interested, which are usually overlooked by literature of nation branding or public diplomacy. And that threw me into literature, which is very much about the construction of the nation. So in one way, we could say that literature of nation branding, public diplomacy, and soft power are very much about how we can commercialize the idea of the nation in order to, again, attract tourist investments and so on. But I started looking also at literature on the construction of the nation. I can talk about later on, but maybe you may be familiar with Benedict Anderson or Michael Billig, or the work of Sabina Michel, which is very much about especially the role of the media in constructing and perpetuating the idea of the nation, this very interesting construct that has only a few centuries old, but we have naturalized it so much across different societies. And more specifically, I wanted to look at protests. So how protests play a role in this negotiation, transformation, or communication of the idea of the nation. But I found, again, very little attention paid to that, even though protests, especially in the last decade, have taken a markedly national character. So we can think of the cases of Brazil, Chile, or even to some extent the United States. And what I mean by that is that if we look at, for instance, protests that happened 20 years ago, the Battle of Seattle, the World Social Forum, and so on, protests at that time had a markedly global character. So they tend to aim global institutions, the International Monetary Fund, global corporations, and so on. And they had a much more, like we could say, a cosmopolitan overview. However, in the last decade, protests have become, we can say perhaps again, national, in terms of like the targets have become national, the targets have become states. So instead of, partly because targeting a government is much easier than targeting the International Monetary Fund, for instance. So you can, the chances of success are higher in that case, but also because quite often people who go to the streets, they claim to act on behalf of the nation. And sometimes they do it explicitly when carrying like national flags, for instance, or I find very interesting when they wear the football t-shirts or when they have banners stating, we are Brazil, we are Chile, we are this nation. So that's something that I find very interesting. And those accounts and those narratives or representations of the nation tend to conflict with those that governments are constructing with nation branding or public diplomacy campaigns. So that is a tension that I found particularly interesting. And by the way, I also find it in the case of the protests in the United States in 2020, in which there were discussions about whether or not the protests were affecting American soft power. So basically, protests can be seen as part of the conflicts or struggles over what the nation supposedly is. And I stress that because quite often academics tend to focus on what states, on what governments are doing. They focus on the campaigns and so on. But I think we should also pay attention to how people in the streets contest that directly or indirectly, and how they also claim to act on behalf of the nation. And these conflicts are communicated, coordinated, shown, enacted in and through national media, but also through foreign news organizations. So it's significant that, as I was showing you earlier, protests in Brazil, but in Chile, in other cases, are covered by the foreign media, and there is a dialogue also at how sometimes the national media pays attention, and also thanks to the affordances of digital media, people within nations can also follow how the protests are seen abroad. But also there is another dialogue between mainstream or legacy and alternative media. So there are different sources that are constructing these alternative accounts of the nation. So that is what I'm being interested in the last few years, and that's kind of like the umbrella that I'm looking in terms of research. But it's very important, I want to stress this, I am not comparing an alleged real version, in this case of Brazil, or lately current research of Chile, with how it's represented in the media. And I stress that because quite often when I read literature on the topic by Latin American scholars, there tends to be like a criticism, especially towards foreign media organizations, because they are not representing the nation correctly. So there are plenty of papers that are like, oh, the New York Times is showing a fake version of Brazil, Chile, or any other nation, and is not showing the truth. That's not my interest. In fact, I'm not sure if it's the truth or real nation actually exists. I'm much more a modernist in that perspective. But actually, I'm much more interested in how particular images of the nation became visible or afraid to be also, and how there are contesting narratives about the nation in the media. There is one particular topic that I want to stress now, that it was relevant at the time of the protests in Brazil, but also it was very relevant during the protests that happened in 2000, that started, I would say, in 2019 in Chile, which was violence, which was one, it wasn't the only one, but it was a particularly salient way of understanding these intranational struggles. And it was very present in national media in Brazil, in foreign media. It was also present in alternative media, and it was both in terms of visual content, in terms of images, but also in terms of the text, in terms of the discussions. And by the way, this was also part of the discussion that happened in Chile, in the social outbreak, in the estallido, was also a big discussion about violence, and it was part of the main topics that were mentioned. So when I go back to the case of Brazil, if I had a look at the coverage by different media organizations, and this is very generally speaking, I can go into detail later on if you want, but generally speaking, the national media, legacy media based in Brazil, they had a shifting approach to the protests in terms of, like, from the perspective of violence. So the first 10 days or 2 weeks, you can say that there was very much an approach that condemned them, that focused on thugs and vandals. But then in mid-June, there is a shift in which there is a discourse of people have a right to protest as long as it is done peacefully. Okay? Alternative media, again, generally speaking, contested those frames from the national media, and they focused very much on what they call was the criminalization of protests by authorities, and also aim to expose the brutality of the police. And foreign media organizations, generally speaking, they had a celebratory approach that emphasized the opposition against the World Cup and the Olympics, and also situated the protests in Brazil as part of a global storylines of middle class unrest that I'm going to mention in a second. So this is, like, generally speaking, what happened. And it's tempting to look at especially the coverage of national media in Brazil within the frame of the protest paradigm. Okay, that, in case you're not familiar, is a very well-known frame in academia, which argues that mainstream or / legacy media, they legitimize protest by emphasizing violence and marginalizing the core concern of protest. So basically, that viewpoint stresses that if you look at the coverage of protests, normally you're going to see that there is plenty of focus on destruction, on riots, on supposed clashes with the police, but not so much on why people are protesting. The protest paradigm taps into broader discussion that see violence as a deviance in modern life, which is sociology of violence as discussed a lot, and I'm happy to talk more later on. And especially in the last 10-15 years, so-called alternative or digital media tend to be celebrated. So basically the argument is like, well, if legacy media falls into the protest paradigm, you're going to find plenty of works which argue that, well, alternative media do not do that, and they have a different viewpoint. I'm very critical of this approach because I feel that it's very static in time and doesn't acknowledge for shifts, for changes over time, like what happened in Brazil. And also in terms of perspective, it doesn't acknowledge that overseas mainstream or legacy media organizations can have a positive approach towards protest, which was also what happened in the case of Brazil. And that's why I think it's important to move beyond the protest paradigm, because the protest paradigm tends to assume that violence necessarily leads to delegitimization. So it assumes that it implies that the peaceful nature of protest is distorted, but does not acknowledge that sometimes, according to some groups, violence and damage are valid tools of dissent. Okay, again, I'm not making an apology of violence or destruction or damage, but there are actors that believe that that is valid. Also, according to the protest paradigm, there will be an alignment between these organizations and authorities. However, there can be clashes sometimes, as happens in Brazil, and to some extent also happen in the Chilean case. And quite often, studies tend to rely solely on news coverage and do not talk to the actors who are covering protests. So in the case of Brazil, I had the opportunity of talking to some of the people involved in the coverage. So I talked to national journalists, I talked to foreign correspondents, and I talked to also members of alternative media collectives. And that gave me an overview of not only what happened in the coverage, but also what occurred behind the scenes. So again, this is a very, very general overview. When I talked to Brazilian journalists, it was very interesting because, again, the coverage, what you could see was very much, again, at the beginning, the story was about thugs and vandals disturbing the social order and affected peaceful working average people. So we could say that's kind of like classic protest paradigm to some extent. However, when I started interviewing journalists, it was very interesting because you could see that there were plenty of struggles in the newsrooms with journalists, some of them expressing supportive views. Not all of them, by the way, but some of them were very much like, well, yeah, actually, I agree with what people are doing in the streets. I really see that in a positive perspective. They did not necessarily write in that way, and what was published, according to them, was sometimes cut by editors or owners and so on. But it's interesting because it starts blurring and nuancing much more this idea of the bad media that is necessarily against protests. And in fact, there were some cases of reporters that tried, they not always succeeded, but they tried to resist sometimes the lines, the editorial lines of their newspapers. There was one reporter, for instance, that told me that in a radio report, she was pushed to use the word vandals, the word thugs, but she compromised by saying that there were acts of vandalism, but she stressed that actually there were demonstrators in the street. So that was something that I found very interesting. Also, when talking to them, it was important to point out that there was a shift in the coverage when journalists started to be targeted by the police. Okay, so that opened the editors and media owners to allow journalists to introduce more nuance to the narrative of the protests. Having said that, it didn't lead to a necessarily supportive view of the grievances of people in the streets, but actually the narrative that emerged was very much of superficially supporting the protests, but in order to start targeting the government at the time of Dilma Rousseff. So again, it was a relatively supportive view of the protests, but it wasn't necessarily in line with what many of the people in the streets wanted, at least originally. When looking at and talking to people who were in alternative media, Ninja and other collectives, again, the coverage, what we can see the narrative was very much about the criminalization of protests and exposing the brutality of the police. And they very much embrace that. They very much talk about how one of the aims of covering the protest was about contesting what they call was the corporate media, right? And also they engage in acts of surveillance. However, over time, when looking in hindsight, some of them were very, very self-critical of how they actually covered the protests. And they, one of them told me that how a photographer had in the collective that he worked with had hours and hours of videos and millions of photos and so on of police abuse, but very little analysis. So he said that they became very similar to the tabloids, that the only difference was that instead of putting the blame on protesters, they put the blame on the police, but they didn't actually talk at the end about why people were protesting. So it was much more about who was beating who. And that leads to perhaps what we can call a sort of reverse protest paradigm. And those were some of the images. All of these are from Media Ninja, which you can easily find online, and very much aligned with that, with denouncing, but also we don't necessarily see what is why people are protesting in the street. And then when I talked to foreign correspondents, again, the coverage was very romantic. Okay, very much like, oh, these are the people in the streets rebelling, and very much about how this is an exercise of democracy, etc., etc. And also the coverage linked what was happening in Brazil to broader events. So it wasn't very rarely was purely about Brazil, but it was about how the episodes in Brazil are an extension of what happened in the Arab Spring, or perhaps are another expression of what's been happening in Israel or the Occupy movement, etc., etc. When talking to journalists with foreign correspondents, I start asking them why they covered the protest and why they covered it this way. And they told me that surprise was the key element, was the key news value for them. Because for them, the perception was that Brazil was a nation that was not very much politically involved. And that's why they were surprised when seeing so many people in the streets. But also surprised in terms of like, oh, we thought that Brazilians love football. Why are they protesting against football? So again, national stereotypes play a lot into how foreign correspondents tell stories. And they had this very positive view of protest, but again, violence was still key, but the violence mostly by the state. Okay? And also, they associated the victims of violence to middle classes. So if violence happened in a favela, foreign correspondents did not really cover that, but it happened if violence or police brutality happened against young students, university students, middle class, etc., that became news. And again, they stressed throughout the coverage in relating protests to global storylines. So what happened here? That there was a much more nuanced picture of the uses and shapes of the news coverage of violence and protest beyond what the protest paradigm says. Because all interviewees agree that violence was key, but they perceive it play an ambivalent role depending on the political agendas of news organizations, affordances and constraints of the media, and also the commercialization of the media. So that very much, again, questions the deterministic assumptions of the protest paradigm, which are very popular, even beyond academia. And I stress this because in the last few years, and also happened in the case of the Chilean protests, but you can also see some examples in the United States, there are still deterministic views that state that the mainstream media or legacy media necessarily are against demonstrations. And by the way, that's also part quite lately of the agendas of demonstrators. That happens in Brazil, and also that happened in Chile, in which there were protests in front of some of the, outside some of the news organizations, especially television. But at the same time, along with introducing more nuance to how legacy media cover protests, I think it's also important to become less romantic about the alternative media. I think that we're much moving towards that. But again, still can be found to some extent that this viewpoint that so-called alternative media necessarily show a fairer, more objective or less violent view of protests. And again, we can talk about this reverse protest paradigm as a way of, in which shows that it's not necessarily the case. I think instead that we need to look at the instrumentalization of ideas of violence and how violence does not necessarily lead to a demonization of social unrest or to question the status quo, but actually this coverage of violence can be exploited for different purposes. And again, I want to stress that sensationalism and drama are not exclusive to legacy media organizations, but so-called alternative media and also foreign news organizations can also focus on, for instance, the violence of the state at the expense of grievances, then basically communicating protests as a right that politically legitimate, but ultimately shallow spectacles of social unrest. So this is my current research in progress. This is just one slide, which I've been continuing exploring some of these viewpoints. So with two colleagues from Chile, Jimena Orchard from the University Alberto Hurtado and Ana Herrera from the Universidad Católica, who have been looking at the television coverage of the estallido social. There have been some research about news coverage and newspaper coverage, but not so much about television. And we want to look at that because television was highly criticized by people who took the streets. And we found that, yeah, effectively, the first 2 or 3 days, there was what we could call a classic protest paradigm and effect. But very soon, there was a much more nuanced and even to some extent supportive view of the protests. There were criticisms to the status quo, which in Chile means when questioning the economic model, were voiced. However, the focus, and this is what I find interesting, was very much on the form of protests. So very much what many narratives, many journalists and so were saying, yes, you can protest, you can question the status quo, you can question liberalism, you can question everything. However, you have to do it peacefully, okay? And everything what did not fit with what was supposedly peaceful was considered as invalid. And also there was some kind of differentiation, and thus fits also with some of the ideas of the nation that I'm interested in, is that violent protests were seen as non-representative of Chile. Okay, they were seen as either bad national, again, like thugs, like criminals and so on, or sometimes, and that was particularly the case of the authorities, as potential foreigners. So probably we have people who are infiltrating us. And this leads us to something like this kind of myth of a good protester, which is, again, someone who can potentially protest against anything, but it has to do it according to the rules and has to be peaceful. And I find this myth very problematic. And these are some of the ideas that I'm exploring now, because then what do we talk when we talk about violence? Because in talking about the myth of the good protesters, there is the implication that society agrees what violence is. But then what do we understand as violence? Is what the authorities claim that violence is? I remember how just before the coronavirus in Chile, at that time, Chilean government wanted to pass a law that criminalized covering your face. So that was something. Also, we need to take into account what happens with groups like the Black Blocs or the Primera Línea in Chile that effectively believe in either symbolic violence or sometimes directly confronting the police. So they really think that violence or destruction and damage is a valid strategy of dissent. Also, what happens with the structural violence that may push people into the streets. And this is a particular concern in Latin America about how governments and states are moving the goalposts and criminalizing more and more acts about protest. And as I was saying, there are cases such as just covering your face that are sometimes considered as expressions of violence or that are not part of peaceful protests. So I want to finish, because lately I've been reading a lot the work of Hannah Arendt to understand much more this intranational context, which for me are part of the mediated nationhood, and about how she writes about how it's interesting that she says that she's not a pacifist, and she writes about how violence is an instrument that can dramatize grievances and bring to public attention, but its unpredictability may undermine the reasons guiding it. And another point that I find very interesting is how, if like happened in Brazil, and how it also happened in Chile, discussions ended up focusing on who was behind the violence. Either was the state or it was protesters, etc. Basically, the state, and this is a quote, have succeeded in turning participants away from politics, and we ended up talking about who beat who, but not so much about other important topics such as the current distribution of economic and political power. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it until there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for such an important and wonderful presentation, Dr. Jiménez-Martínez. We will now open up for Q&A for this portion of the webinar. So I want to remind our audience to please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get as many of them answered as possible. I'll get us started with an initial question. You mentioned the case of nation branding and the role of protests in Brazil in 2013 for the World Cup. And I am wondering if you can tell us a bit about how this took shape in the case for the Rio 2016 Olympics. I know there was a lot of turmoil going on in Brazil at the time. And being there, I remember kind of this opposing sentiment from the public to be holding the Olympics and how that manifested in the media representations. So I'm curious to know how these media representations were impacted not only through the perception of the country worldwide, but also how the media coverage managed national protests, national sentiments, and other national issues during this time.
Mm-hmm. I think that the Olympics are very important, and they have to be seen in relation with what happened before. So we can put them as part of a broader narrative about the Brazilian nation, in terms of that when the 2013 protest happened, it was very much a shock, okay? Because supposedly both the World Cup and Olympics were going to be the confirmation of that Brazil was kind of like about to reach the club of almost developed countries. The World Cup ended up becoming very much like a management exercise in terms of like of not so much a confirmation, but very much like a relief of, okay, things resulted okay. And then in between the World Cup and the Olympics, you can see that very much the coverage was focused much more on managing damage, okay, rather than, again, in pushing it forward to confirm how amazing Brazil was. And we can see that there was a certain overall narrative of how wonderful Brazil was, like in between the early 2000s, like until just before the World Cup, and basically at the time of the Olympic Games, there was already a massive unease, which wasn't only because of the coverage, but you could see also the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. You could see also the economic consequences and so on. So this is never purely about the media, but it's also about what's happening out there. So at least from the perspective of the Mediated Nationhood, the Olympics were very much a bittersweet moment, okay? In which it was very much kind of like the view, particularly from abroad, was like, yeah, we had a good sports spectacle. However, the host is definitely not having a good time, and he has a very corrupt vice president as president at the moment, and his economy is tanking. So that was how it was seen. And then that was also seen as kind of like the seeds of the Bolsonaro government afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. And I think something that's really important that you mentioned is not only what is the media portraying, but what's happening in the country at the time, and foreigners, what are they seeing? How are they interpreting these events? I think that's really important. So thank you for that. We have a question from our audience. Olivia asks, I'm wondering if you can make any comparisons, contrasts in your research with the student protests in Mexico in 1968 that in many ways were intertwined with hosting the Olympics and the configuration of how Mexico wanted to present its image to the international community.
Yeah, I found the Mexican case fascinating. I read a lot about it when I was doing my research, and because it's the Olympic Games in Mexico were very much, if I'm not wrong, I think that they were framed kind of like the first games in the developing world, and for Mexico was they wanted to show very much this. It was the context of Cold War. So they wanted to show that, yeah, we're not part of necessarily like part of the capitalist world, or we're not totally communist, etc., but we're like something different. So they wanted to become representative. And it's very interesting that the Cultural Olympiad, even though cultural activities have happened before around Olympic Games, but it took a whole different view in the case of Mexico. So I think that what happened in Tlatelolco, the massacre was, for me, resonates very much to what happened in Brazil. However, a big difference, I think it's in the scale and speed of foreign coverage, right? That I was reading a few months ago, the book of Activists Without Borders by Katrin Siegling, and I forgot her co-author. And they look at the case of Mexico and say how the Tlatelolco massacre on a global level didn't have that much impact in comparison with other events that happened afterwards. Domestically, I cannot speak. I'm sure that someone else can say much more about it. So I think that was an important difference. And also I think that another thing that is happening is that there is a narrative which is questioning a lot the usefulness of Olympic Games. I think that at the time in which Mexico hosted, there is still the belief that, oh, the Olympic Games or the World Cup are very much a celebration of the best of mankind. And nowadays they're very much like this traveling circus that they're exploiting local populations to benefit the International Olympic Committee or FIFA. So there is very much of like, why are we doing this?
Yes, 100%. And it's a really important debate at the moment, especially as we approach the Paris Olympics. So that's something to keep in mind. We have another question from Edna, who asks, do you think right nationalism is more successful in capturing the idea of nation using national symbols, while left social movements tend to be unable to hold the nation narrative? If you agree with this impression, do the media have a part in this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes also apart from the origin of the right and left. I mean, the left was historically always associated with the idea of internationalism, right? I'm talking the 19th century and so on, and it always struggles with the idea of the nation, while the the right is much more comfortable with that, especially, and that was especially pronounced in Europe with the after the world wars, and which the right was especially associated with that. Having said that, I find Latin America that it's quite interesting, because the idea of the nation is sometimes used to protect people. Okay, maybe not necessarily explicitly. It's not necessarily framed as we are nationalists, but when I think of the dictatorships, for instance, in Latin America, it's very interesting how many of the human rights abuses were committed on behalf of the nation. However, many of the social movements of the opposition also claim to be acting on behalf of the nation. So to some extent, the idea of the nation is always implied there, okay? But I agree that especially in the last 5-10 years, the right has been much more successful to tap into the anxieties that people feel regarding the idea of the nation, has been much more successful, are exploiting that for the benefits and for their agendas.
Thank you. And we have another question from the audience, from Tatiana, who asks, based on your experience, how do you evaluate the media coverage of the war so far in Ukraine? Are journalists mere observers, or in the name of humanizing the story, they become part of the story?
Oh, that is a really, really good question. I think that it's difficult to talk about the media as a one homogeneous thing. I think it depends on where we're looking at. For instance, media, I've only anecdotally seen some of the Latin American correspondents in Ukraine, and it's slightly different, not radical, but slightly different to the viewpoint of European correspondents. The European correspondents cover very much from the perspective of this is going to affect us, this is going to touch us to some extent, and sometimes, willingly or not, Western correspondents become part of the intelligentsia of different governments. My impression, and this is pure anecdote, is that some Latin American journalists have focused much more on the spectacle side. So it's kind of like, this is something big and terrible, but doesn't necessarily is going to have a big consequence on us. And it's also interesting to start looking at at how they intend to localize the stories. So they try to look for people who speak Spanish, or the connection of the story with Chile, Argentina, etc., etc. So I think it's a collage of different perspectives. And yeah, I'm not expert in Russia, but I'm sure that the Russian media, for what we know, is coming from a different, a radically different perspective that is not even a word for them.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing. We have another question from the audience. Someone asks, what is the content analysis methodology that you followed? For example, thematic, discourse, etc., and what other themes emerged?
Yeah, I use, well, when looking at the coverage, a thematic analysis, because that gave me the broader overview. But in some specific research, in some specific outputs, I have applied a bit of discourse. But thematic gave me I didn't want to use the traditional content analysis because I found it a bit static, okay? And in terms of like, you have an overview of everything. Well, I'm much more interested in the shifts and the changes over time. And I think it's important to have a much more longitudinal viewpoint of approach to media coverage. And yeah, there were plenty of other points. Like, and for instance, when thinking of foreign media coverage, it was very interesting, a sort of paternalism towards Brazil, in terms of like, oh, look, people are going to the streets, are protesting. How wonderful, finally they're doing it. They've been abused for all these years. Finally, they're in the streets. Like, finally, they're starting to become a little bit like us. So that was something very, very interesting. And also in the so-called alternative media, they had a very ambivalent viewpoint towards legacy media. So nominally, they were very critical about them. However, they also relied on legacy mainstream media if it validated their points. And that also happened, by the way, with when national media did the same with foreign media. What I mean by that is that if an alternative media collective saw that a national newspaper wrote something that was very much in line with previous coverage of alternative media, was like even Folia, even Estados Abables, something like that. But also happened in a local or national level. And just like I found very interesting how how both alternative but also legacy media covered how the protests were covered abroad. So this is what the world is saying about us. This is how the New York Times is saying about us. But by the way, with the world, they don't mean media from Africa. They don't mean media from Eastern Europe. Quite often, they mean the New York Times, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the Guardian. So what is posited as the world is very much a very narrow set of media organizations.
Very interesting. Thank you. We have a question from Harry, who asks, have you thought about how national, international media coverage of Latin American protests influenced protesters and their strategies and or tactics, or how digital media practices have changed Latin American social movements?
Oh yeah, in the interviews that was very interesting. For instance, when there was a bunch of protesters that they told me originally they were not against the Olympics or the World Cup, that the agenda was completely different. However, when they started realizing that they could get media coverage if they called their protest like, oh, we're against the World Cup, and then they put the message, they started doing that in order to get attention. But and also the technicalities of the media changed them. Like several of them told me that they became more visual in order to get more attention. So I remember one collective that told me that he said, originally we used to write manifestos and we put them on a website and nobody read the manifestos. So then they ended up relying much more on videos or photos, and that was a way of capturing attention. So yeah, we cannot say that digital media is responsible for protests, because we have a long history of protests without digital media in the past, but it definitely shapes them to some extent. And also the fact that people are aware that, again, the world is looking at them also shape them. And so it's even sometimes people that go to the street, I think it's not casual that some of them were with banners in English. So that was also a way of trying to get the attention of foreign media organizations.
Very interesting, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. Something to keep in mind. And then for our last question, we have an audience member who asks, I would like to ask how to think about the notion of national media that exposes your work without falling into the notion of a nation that criticizes. I would like to know if we need to refer then to a certain contract from the enunciative and only then describe strategies of discursive differentiation.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I think that implied on it, there's a really a valid point that basically what is national in the national media. And of course, yeah, what I put here was simplification, because that's a very interesting question that deserves to be examined in terms of like sometimes the ownership of some so-called national media organizations is actually foreigner, and also sometimes the people who work at them are not necessarily national. So it's interesting to look how there is sometimes, it's not very big, but sometimes there is a certain transnationalization to some minimum extent of journalists. So some of the foreign correspondents that I talked to, sometimes they had a little gig towards national media, for instance, but also happened the other way around. So it's what do we understand as international media. Some foreign correspondents were actually Brazilians, you know, working for them. And also there are organizations like BBC Mundo, for instance, which occupies like a space in between that is technically foreigner, but is same at Brazil. So I think that there is a blurred line there. Having said that, I found it very interesting that from a discursive perspective, ideas of the nation and the boundaries between the inside and the outside are still strong. So I think that one thing is we can question and rightly criticize how objectively these media are foreigner or national or alternative, etc. But the beliefs that exist still guide the actions of individuals. And I find that very, very important.
Thank you very much, César. Sorry, I did not mean my appearance on the screen to interrupt your final answer, but thank you so very much for this excellent, truly excellent seminar. Lots of engagement from the audience. Thank you, Valerie, for, as always, superb moderation. Thank you to our audience for staying with us through the end, and I invite everybody to join us next Thursday for a new installment of the virtual seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Once again, thank you very much, César.
Thanks very much for the invitation.